Clara had perfected the art of being unseen, moving through the frontier outpost like a shadow that performed necessary tasks without drawing attention or expectation. At 17, she had spent the last 4 years working as a servant for the military garrison, taken in after her parents succumbed to fever during a brutal winter that claimed many lives in the surrounding settlements. The soldiers barely acknowledged her existence beyond barking orders for meals, laundry, and cleaning. The officers' wives treated her with casual dismissal, viewing her as just another unfortunate orphan whose labor could be utilized without compensation beyond minimal food and shelter in a cramped storage room that doubled as her living quarters. The Isao outpost itself sat at the edge of civilization, a collection of rough buildings surrounded by wooden palisades that provided psychological comfort more than actual security. Beyond those walls stretched endless prairie that gradually transformed into more arid terrain, the kind of landscape that swallowed travelers who ventured unprepared into its vast emptiness. Supply wagons arrived irregularly, bringing news from distant towns and reminding the garrison that they existed on the frontier's knife edge, maintaining nominal authority over territory that truly belonged to the harsh elements and the displaced peoples who had lived there for generations before settlers arrived with their claims and conflicts. Clara's days followed monotonous patterns, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast for soldiers rotating through their shifts, scrubbing floors that immediately accumulated new layers of dust and mud, mending uniforms torn by hard use, washing dishes and linens in water she hauled from the well with aching arms. She spoke little because no one listened when she did, asked for nothing because requests were either ignored or met with irritation, and dreamed rarely because exhaustion claimed her the moment she collapsed onto her thin mattress each night. She had learned to exist in a kind of suspended state, neither fully alive nor entirely resigned to mere survival, simply continuing because stopping seemed impossible. Everything changed on a scorching afternoon in late summer when Clara was hanging laundry in the courtyard and overheard soldiers discussing their latest prisoner. A Lakota warrior had been captured after what the men described as a skirmish near a water source both sides claimed as territory. The warrior had been alone when encountered, apparently scouting rather than raiding, but the patrol had taken him into custody regardless. Clara listened while pretending complete absorption in her work, a skill she had perfected over years of being simultaneously present and dismissed. The soldiers spoke casually about the prisoner's likely fate, a quick tribunal followed by execution at dawn, standard procedure for captured hostiles according to the officer commanding the outpost. That evening, Clara found herself drawn toward the small jail structure where prisoners were held, a squat building with barred windows and a single guard posted outside. She had no clear purpose in approaching, only a vague compulsion to see the man whose death had been decided so casually by people who would then continue their routines as if nothing significant had occurred. The guard paid her no attention as she moved near enough to glimpse through one of the barred windows, her small stature and practiced invisibility making her beneath notice as usual. Inside the dim cell, a man sat on the floor with his back against the stone wall, his hands bound and his posture suggesting injury or exhaustion. Even in the failing light, Clara could see the distinctive features and clothing that marked him as Lakota, the dark hair falling past his shoulders, the buckskin garments decorated with beadwork now torn and stained, the bearing that maintained dignity despite circumstances designed to strip it away. He seemed to sense her observation and turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers through the bars with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no pleading in his gaze, no appeal for mercy or help, simply acknowledgement of her presence and perhaps a flicker of curiosity about why this young woman was staring at him. Clara retreated quickly, her heart pounding with confusion about her own reaction. She had seen prisoners before, had overheard countless discussions of military justice and frontier necessity, had learned to accept that this world operated according to rules she could neither change nor escape. Yet something about this particular prisoner unsettled her carefully constructed numbness. Perhaps it was his youth. He seemed only a few years older than herself, or the quiet dignity he maintained despite facing imminent death. Perhaps it was simply that she recognized in him a fellow human being, whose existence was considered expendable by those with power to make such determinations. Whatever the reason, Clara found herself unable to dismiss his image from her mind as she returned to her cramped quarters and lay sleepless on her mattress, listening to night sounds of the outpost and wrestling with thoughts she could not fully articulate. She thought about her own expendability, about how easily she had been absorbed into this place where she worked endlessly, for people who would not remember her name if she disappeared tomorrow. She thought about her parents, who had been kind and loving before illness took them, who had taught her that every person possessed inherent worth, regardless of circumstances or social position. She thought about the Lakota warrior, awaiting execution for the crime of existing in territory his people had occupied long before forts and garrisons claimed dominion. Most troublingly, she thought about the dawn that was approaching with terrible inevitability, bringing with it a death that seemed wrong in ways she struggled to explain even to herself. As the night deepened and the outpost settled into relative quiet, Clara made a decision that defied every practical consideration and every survival instinct she had developed during her years of invisible servitude. She could not stop the execution through official channels. She had no voice, no authority, no standing to challenge military decisions. But she could perhaps prevent it through action that would cost her everything she had, which admittedly was very little. The idea was insane, suicidal even, yet once it formed in her mind she could not dislodge it. She would help the Lakota warrior escape, and if necessary, she would go with him into whatever uncertain future awaited beyond the outpost walls. The decision brought strange clarity, as if she had been waiting years for a reason, compelling enough to justify leaving behind a life that barely qualified as living. Clara waited until the deepest hours of night, when the outpost settled into its most vulnerable state. Guards drowsy at their posts, soldiers sleeping off exhaustion or whiskey, officers secure in their quarters, with no expectation of significant disturbance. She had observed the garrison's rhythms carefully over years of invisible presence, noting patterns and weaknesses without conscious intention to use such knowledge. Now that accumulated, understanding became crucial as she prepared for actions that would irrevocably transform her from overlooked servant to fugitive criminal in the span of a few desperate hours. She gathered what supplies she could without arousing suspicion during her raid. Evening tasks, extra bread wrapped in cloth, a water skin she filled and concealed, a knife from the kitchen that no one would miss immediately, a worn blanket that had been set aside for disposal. She also took a ring of keys that hung in the officers' quarters, copying the specific key for the jail onto a piece of wire, using a technique she had learned from a former prisoner who had worked briefly as a handyman before being released. The crude copy might not work, but it represented her only realistic option for opening the cell without alerting guards. Through violence or extended struggle with locks, Clara moved through the shadowed outpost like the ghost she had always been, her familiarity with every building and pathway allowing her to navigate with minimal sound. She approached the jail from the rear, where shadows were deepest and sight lines from the guard post were most obstructed. Her heart hammered so loudly, she felt certain everyone in the fort must hear it, yet she forced herself to breathe steadily and move with deliberate care rather than panicked haste that would invite mistakes. She reached the barred window she had looked through earlier and whispered softly, hoping the warrior inside would hear without being startled into making noise that would alert the guard. After several tense moments, movement stirred within the cell, and the warrior's face appeared at the window, his expression showing surprise and confusion. Clara spoke in barely audible tones, explaining quickly that she was going to try to free him, that he needed to be ready to move silently and quickly when she opened the cell. She could not tell if he understood her words or trusted her intentions, but his eyes held hers with focused intensity that suggested he was at least willing to see what she attempted. She gestured for him to move away from the door, then crept around to the front of the jail where the guard sat on a wooden chair, his head nodding forward in exhausted half-sleep. Mapia seemed similarly curious about Clara, asking through their limited shared language why she had helped him, what she had left behind, where she thought they were going. Clara struggled to explain with her vocabulary limitations, finally resorting to gestures and expressions that conveyed her rejection of the injustice she had witnessed. Her lack of meaningful ties to the outpost, her acceptance of whatever fate awaited them in the wilderness. Mapia listened carefully, his dark eyes studying her face as if trying to understand motivations that must seem incomprehensible from his cultural perspective. Finally, he spoke a phrase in Lakota that he then translated haltingly into English. Brave heart, foolish head. The assessment was delivered without judgment, simply as an observation, and Clara found herself laughing quietly despite their dire circumstances. He was not wrong. Their third night of travel brought them into genuine desert, landscape where vegetation became sparse and the ground turned to sand and stone that held the day's heat long into the evening. Water was becoming a serious concern, despite careful rationing and the moisture they had extracted from cacti. Clara's lips were cracked and her throat burned with constant thirst, while Mapia moved with the determined focus of someone pushing through discomfort through sheer will. They were deep into territory, where the outpost would be unlikely to pursue even if search parties had been organized. But that safety from human threats came at the cost of increased vulnerability to the harsh environment itself. As they rested during the fourth day, Mapia's condition deteriorated noticeably. His wounds were showing signs of infection, despite Clara's attempts to keep them clean with their limited water supply. Fever made his skin hot to the touch, and his movements became less steady, though he continued trying to mask his suffering. Clara felt helpless watching him struggle, knowing her supplies included nothing that could properly treat infected injuries in this environment. She urged him to rest longer, but he refused, insisting through gestures and broken English that they needed to reach a specific location he knew from previous travels, a place where water existed and where they might find temporary safety. That night's travel was torturous, with Mapia pushing through obvious pain and illness, while Clara supported him when his steps faltered. She had no idea how far they needed to go, or whether they would reach his intended destination before his condition became critical. All she could do was continue following his halting guidance, maintaining their direction, even when everything in her screamed to stop and rest. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and terrible in the starlight, indifferent to their suffering and survival. Clara understood now why people spoke of the wilderness with such respect and fear. It gave nothing easily, and took everything from those who entered, unprepared or unlucky. Dawn of the fifth day found them struggling across a landscape of rust-colored rocks and wind-swept sand formations that seemed to shift and transform with each step. Mapia was barely upright, leaning heavily on Clara's slight frame, his breathing labored and his consciousness clearly wavering between lucidity and fever-induced confusion. Clara fought rising panic as she tried to keep them moving forward, though she had no certainty they were even traveling in the right direction anymore. Mapia's guidance had become less reliable as illness overtook him, his gestures vague and sometimes contradictory, leaving Clara to make decisions about their path based on instinct rather than knowledge. Then, as the sun climbed higher and heat began building toward intolerable levels, Mapia seemed to rally slightly. He pulled away from Clara's support and pointed urgently toward a rocky formation ahead, speaking rapidly in Lakota with occasional English words mixed in: water, safe, hidden. Clara did not understand everything he was trying to convey, but she grasped that he believed their destination was near, that survival depended on reaching that formation before his strength gave out completely. She supported him again, and they staggered forward together, each step requiring enormous effort as exhaustion and dehydration took their toll on bodies already pushed beyond normal limits. The formation revealed itself gradually as they approached, a jumble of massive boulders that created shadowed spaces and natural passages through the rock. Mapia guided them into a narrow opening that Clara would never have noticed on her own, leading deeper into the formation until they emerged in a hidden alcove where, miraculously, a small spring bubbled up from underground sources and collected in a natural basin before seeping back into the stone. The sight of that clear water was almost overwhelming after days of careful rationing and desperate thirst. Clara helped Mapia settle near the basin, then filled their water skin and drank deeply, the cool liquid like a blessing after the torment of desert crossing. With immediate hydration needs addressed, Clara turned her attention to Mapia's deteriorating condition. His fever had intensified, and the infected wounds needed treatment beyond her limited capabilities. She cleaned them as best she could with the spring water and strips torn from her already ragged dress, knowing it was inadequate, but having no better options. Mahpia drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in Lakota, perhaps to people from his past, perhaps to spirits or ancestors his culture believed surrounded them. Clara sat beside him through the burning daylight hours, keeping him in shade, cooling his feverish skin with water-soaked cloth, and silently pleading with whatever forces governed survival in this merciless landscape to let him live. As afternoon wore into evening, Mahpia's fever broke slightly, and he woke with clearer eyes than Clara had seen since the infection took hold. He drank water gratefully when she offered it, then spoke in halting English mixed with Lakota, trying to explain something important he needed her to understand. Through patience and repetition, Clara eventually grasped his message. This spring was a sacred place for his people, hidden and protected, known only to those who had been taught its location by elders. By bringing her here, he was sharing something precious and secret, trusting her with knowledge that carried deep cultural significance. He wanted her to understand that this gift was his way of honoring her courage and repaying the debt created when she freed him from certain death. Clara was moved by this revelation, understanding that Mahpia was offering her not just physical sanctuary, but also acceptance into a circle of trust that transcended their cultural differences. She tried to express her gratitude and her recognition of the honor he was extending, using their growing shared vocabulary and hoping her earnestness conveyed what her limited words could not fully articulate. Mahpia seemed satisfied with her response, relaxing slightly, as if he had accomplished something important despite his weakened state. Over the next several days, they remained at the hidden spring, while Mahpia slowly recovered strength, and his wounds began healing properly now that they could be cleaned regularly with good water. Clara explored their sanctuary, discovering that the formation provided excellent concealment from anyone passing nearby, that several natural passages allowed emergency exits in different directions, and that small caves within the rocks offered shelter from weather and observation. Food remained a concern, but Mahpia showed her which desert plants were edible when properly prepared, expanding their survival options beyond the meager supplies she had brought from the outpost. During the long quiet hours as Mahpia healed, they continued building their shared language, each teaching the other words and phrases that allowed increasingly complex communication. Clara learned about Lakota culture, spirituality and traditions that had governed his people for generations before settlers arrived, claiming land as property to be owned rather than shared. Mahpia learned about Clara's childhood, her parents' deaths, her years of invisible servitude, and the decision that had brought her to this unlikely place beside a spring hidden among desert rocks. Their conversations created intimacy and understanding that Clara had never experienced with anyone, a connection built through shared hardship and mutual dependence. One evening, as they sat watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Mahpia spoke seriously about their future choices. His English had improved enough to express complex thoughts, and he needed Clara to understand their options and their implications. They could remain at the spring temporarily, but eventually they would need to move, either attempting to reach Mahpia's people on distant reservation lands or creating a new life in some remote location where neither military nor tribal authorities would find them. Both paths carried enormous risks and uncertainties. Mahpia made clear that Clara was free to make her own choice, that he would help her return to settler civilization if that was what she wanted, that she owed him nothing despite having saved his life. Clara considered his words carefully, thinking about the life she had left behind at the outpost. The invisibility, the endless labor without appreciation, the future of continued servitude stretching ahead with no hope of change or improvement. Then she thought about these days in the desert, where survival itself was an achievement, where she and Mahpia had built partnership based on mutual respect and shared effort, where she felt more genuinely alive than during all her years of safety behind outpost walls. Her choice was not difficult once she honestly examined what each option offered. She told Mahpia in their mixed language that she wanted to continue forward with him, to see where this journey led, to build something new rather than returning to something old and suffocating. Mapia accepted her decision with a nod that conveyed both satisfaction and concern. He explained that the path ahead would be difficult, that reaching his people meant crossing hundreds of miles through dangerous territory, that they would need to avoid both military patrols and hostile parties from various tribes whose territories they would traverse. They would be fugitives in the truest sense, people who had vanished from their previous lives and who could never safely return. Clara understood these realities and accepted them, recognizing that she had committed herself to this course when she freed Mapia from his cell. There was no going back, only forward into uncertainty that felt more honest than the false security she had known before. After 2 weeks at the hidden spring, Mapia declared himself fit enough to travel, and they began preparing for the next phase of their journey. They gathered supplies carefully, filling water skins, collecting edible desert plants that could be preserved, fashioning better traveling gear from materials available in their sanctuary. Mapia also spent time teaching Clara crucial survival skills: how to read subtle signs in the landscape, how to move efficiently through difficult terrain, how to conserve energy during long marches, and how to remain aware of their surroundings without appearing obviously watchful. She proved an eager student, understanding that her life might depend on mastering these lessons. They departed the spring at twilight, traveling by starlight as they had during their initial escape. Mapia set their course northeast, explaining through their improved communication that they were heading toward territory where his people traditionally traveled during certain seasons. He could not promise they would find anyone, but he believed their best chance of eventual safety lay in reaching areas where Lakota presence was more likely. The journey would take many weeks, if not months, requiring them to move carefully through lands claimed by various competing interests: military patrols, settler parties, other tribal groups whose relationships with Lakota ranged from allied to hostile. The landscape they traversed was harsh, but possessed a stark beauty that Clara grew to appreciate despite the constant challenges. They crossed wind-carved stone formations that glowed red and gold in sunrise and sunset light. They navigated canyons where ancient peoples had left paintings on rock walls depicting hunts and ceremonies from forgotten eras. They found occasional water sources that Mapia remembered or located through careful observation of vegetation and animal tracks. Each day was different. Each brought new tests of their endurance and resourcefulness, yet they continued forward with determination, born of having already survived impossibilities. As weeks accumulated into months, Clara transformed physically and mentally. The soft servant girl from the outpost hardened into someone capable of walking 20 miles daily across brutal terrain, of sleeping on rocky ground without complaint, of eating whatever food was available without squeamishness, of facing danger with calm assessment rather than panic. Her skin bronzed from constant sun exposure, her hands roughened from climbing and working with primitive tools. Her body grew lean and strong from the demanding travel and limited rations. More importantly, her spirit evolved from resigned acceptance into active engagement. She was no longer simply enduring life, but rather choosing each day to continue the journey despite hardship. Mapia also transformed, though his changes were perhaps less visible. His injuries healed cleanly, leaving scars that added to the map of experience already written on his body. His initial wariness of Clara gradually shifted into genuine partnership as he witnessed her courage and adaptability repeatedly. He began teaching her not just survival skills, but also aspects of his culture, songs his people sang, stories that explained their understanding of the world, spiritual practices that connected them to the land and to cycles larger than individual lives. Clara absorbed these teachings gratefully, recognizing them as gifts of trust that honored her commitment to their shared journey. They encountered other travelers occasionally, once a group of prospectors heading toward rumored mineral deposits, another time a family of settlers whose wagon had broken down miles from anywhere. In each case, Mapia and Clara remained hidden or passed quickly with minimal interaction, recognizing that their safety depended on remaining unremarked and unmemorable. They developed cover stories they could deploy if questioned, claiming to be siblings traveling to join family, or a young married couple seeking homestead opportunities, whatever narrative seemed most plausible for their circumstances. The lies came more easily than Clara had expected. Perhaps because the essential truth beneath them, that they were people simply trying to survive, remained constant. One evening, as they made camp in a sheltered canyon, Mapia spoke about what he observed in Clara's transformation. He told her that she had become what his people might call Wikasa Wakan, a person who walked between worlds, belonging fully to neither but capable of understanding both. The observation struck Clara as profoundly true. She was no longer the invisible servant girl who had existed within settler society, yet neither was she Lakota, despite having learned much of their ways. She existed in liminal space between cultures, connected to Mapia through shared experience, but maintaining her own distinct identity. She asked him if he felt similarly transformed, and after thoughtful silence, he acknowledged that he too had become something different from what he was before, perhaps less purely Lakota but richer for having incorporated understanding of another way of seeing the world. As autumn approached, and they traveled into higher terrain where early cold suggested the season was changing, they finally encountered other Lakota, a small band moving toward winter camping grounds. The meeting was tense initially, with armed warriors surrounding Mapia and Clara, while questions were asked and explanations demanded. Mapia spoke rapidly in his own language, clearly recounting their story, while the band's members examined Clara with expressions mixing curiosity, suspicion, and confusion about why this white woman traveled with one of their warriors. Eventually, an elder woman stepped forward and spoke with Mapia at length, asking pointed questions that he answered with what seemed like complete honesty, including details about Clara's role in his escape and their subsequent journey. The elder woman turned to Clara and spoke in surprisingly good English, explaining that Mapia's account was difficult to believe, but that his reputation as an honest man predated his capture and gave his words weight. She wanted to know Clara's intentions, whether she sought to join their people, whether she understood what such a choice would mean, whether she was prepared for the challenges and prejudices she would face as an outsider attempting to live among them. Clara answered honestly that she had no clear plan beyond continuing with Mapia, that she understood she would never be fully accepted by either world, but hoped to find space where she could exist authentically, that she was willing to face whatever challenges came, because the alternative was returning to a life of invisibility and meaninglessness. The elder woman considered Clara's words, then made a decision. The band would allow Clara and Mapia to travel with them for now, though Clara's permanent status would need to be determined through more formal processes, involving other leaders when they reached winter camps. It was provisional acceptance rather than full welcome, but it represented more than Clara had dared hope for, the possibility of belonging somewhere, even if that belonging remained conditional and complicated. As the band began moving again with Clara and Mapia now incorporated into their traveling group, Clara felt something shift in her understanding of their journey. They had not just been fleeing into the wilderness. They had been traveling towards something, toward a future that might actually be possible, despite all odds against it. Winter settled over the high plains with brutal efficiency, bringing temperatures that killed careless travelers and tested even experienced survival skills. The band that had accepted Clara and Mapia proved to be part of a larger group assembling at traditional winter camping grounds, a collection of families and individuals who maintained older ways of life, despite increasing pressures from reservation systems and military campaigns that sought to contain all tribal peoples within defined boundaries. Clara found herself in a community unlike anything she had experienced, where daily rhythms followed patterns established over generations, where individual identity was deeply connected to collective well-being, where her presence as an outsider created ongoing tension, despite growing acceptance of her genuine partnership with Mapia. The elderly woman who had initially questioned Clara took interest in her education about Lakota ways, teaching her practical skills necessary for contributing to the community's survival, how to properly prepare hides for clothing and shelter, how to preserve and prepare traditional foods, how to craft tools and implements using available materials. Clara proved an attentive student, recognizing that earning her place required demonstrating willingness to adapt and contribute, rather than expecting accommodation of her different background. Some community members remained suspicious or openly hostile to her presence, viewing her as a potential spy or threat, But others, particularly those who heard Mahpia's account of how she had risked everything to free him, showed cautious acceptance and even occasional kindness. Mahpia himself held conflicted status within the winter camp. He was welcomed as one returning from presumed death, yet his decision to bring Clara challenged cultural norms and created controversy among leaders who worried about the precedent such acceptance might set. Several formal councils were held to discuss their situation, with arguments presented about tradition, about security, about the changing world that demanded adaptation while maintaining core identity. Clara was not present for these discussions, but heard about them through Mahpia, who explained that his people struggled with how to remain themselves, while recognizing that old certainties no longer held in a world transformed by forces beyond any individual group's control. The resolution that emerged from these councils was pragmatic, if not entirely satisfying. Clara could remain with the winter camp under Mahpia's sponsorship, but her status would be provisional indefinitely. She would be expected to contribute, labor and accept instruction in Lakota ways, but she would not participate in certain ceremonies or receive full integration into the community's spiritual life. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely yet represented the best outcome available given the circumstances. Clara accepted these terms without complaint, understanding that even conditional acceptance was generous, given how completely she disrupted normal categories and expectations. As winter deepened, Clara and Mahpia's relationship also evolved in ways that had been inevitable since their escape from the outpost, but which neither had explicitly acknowledged during the desperate months of survival-focused travel. The shared hardship had created bonds that transcended simple partnership, and gradually they recognized what had developed between them: affection, attraction, deep respect, and something approaching love, though filtered through the complex realities of their different backgrounds and the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. They began sharing a dwelling, which raised eyebrows among some community members, but which Mahpia defended as consistent with their journey and their commitment to each other. Clara found comfort in this deepening intimacy, in finally having someone who saw her completely and chose her presence deliberately rather than tolerating it out of obligation or necessity. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and the winter camp began preparing for seasonal migration to follow traditional patterns of movement across the landscape. During this time of transition, troubling news arrived through scouts who ranged far from the main group. Military patrols had intensified their searches for tribal bands living outside reservation boundaries, and there were reports of forced relocations and harsh penalties for those who resisted confinement to designated lands. The community faced difficult decisions about whether to remain mobile and risk confrontation, or to accept reservation life with its restrictions, but also its relative safety from immediate military action. Clara listened to these discussions, with growing understanding that the life she and Mahpia had found during the winter months was itself unsustainable in the longer term. The world was changing in ways that made traditional existence increasingly difficult, if not impossible. The open lands where tribal peoples had moved freely for generations were being claimed, fenced, settled and controlled by systems that recognized only specific forms of land use and ownership. The community could not hide indefinitely, and each passing season brought closer the inevitable confrontation between their way of life and the dominant culture's determination to reshape the frontier according to its own vision. One evening, as Clara and Mahpia sat outside their dwelling watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors, he spoke about a possibility he had been considering carefully. There were places, he explained, far to the north and west, where terrain was so difficult and resources so scarce that few settlers bothered to claim them. Remote valleys, hidden canyons, isolated areas where a small group might live largely, unnoticed if they were willing to accept extreme hardship and complete separation from both tribal and settler communities. It would mean leaving his people again, abandoning the provisional place they had found during the winter, but it might represent their only chance of building something lasting that honored both their identities without requiring either to submit to systems that would diminish them. Clara understood what he was proposing, essentially disappearing, removing themselves so completely from both societies that they became invisible to the forces that sought to control, categorize, and contain everyone within defined boundaries. It was an extreme choice, one that meant accepting permanent exile and probable obscurity. Yet as she considered the alternatives, attempting to integrate more fully into Lakota life despite being an outsider, or returning to settler society, where she would face consequences for her actions, and where Mapia could never be accepted, the idea of vanishing into remote wilderness held strange appeal. They had already demonstrated they could survive impossible conditions. Perhaps they could build something more than mere survival in a place where no one would look for them or try to impose expectations they could not meet. Over the following weeks, Clara and Mapia prepared quietly for another departure, gathering supplies and information about the territories they would need to cross. They spoke with elders who remembered remote areas from their younger travels, learning about landmarks and resources that might sustain them. They explained their plans to the elderly woman who had first questioned Clara, seeking her blessing if not her full approval. She listened carefully to their reasoning, then offered a response that stayed with Clara long afterward. She said that every generation must find its own path through changing worlds, that Clara and Mapia represented something new that did not fit old categories, and that perhaps their journey toward the unknown was exactly the right response to a world where all the old certainties had been disrupted. They departed as spring moved into summer, leaving the camp early one morning with minimal fanfare and few goodbyes beyond those closest to Mapia. Their leaving created both relief and sadness within the community, relief that a source of ongoing controversy was removing itself, sadness that two people who had demonstrated courage and determination were choosing exile over integration. Clara felt surprisingly little regret as they walked away from the camp and toward the distant mountains that would be their guide northward. She had learned during the winter that belonging was more complex than simply being accepted into an existing structure, that sometimes creating your own path was more honest than forcing yourself into categories that never quite fit. Their journey north took them through territory even more remote than the desert they had crossed during their initial flight. They traveled through deep forests where sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, across mountain passes where snow remained. Even in summer months, along rivers so clear and cold they seemed to flow directly from some eternal source. They encountered almost no one during this travel, occasionally seeing distant smoke from other travelers' fires, once crossing paths with trappers heading south who eyed them curiously but asked no questions, mostly moving through wilderness that felt truly untouched by the conflicts and transformations reshaping the settled lands they had left behind. After months of this northern migration, they found what they had been seeking, a hidden valley surrounded by peaks so steep and terrain so difficult that access required knowledge of specific passes that were obvious only if you knew where to look. A stream ran through the valley providing water, and the southern exposure created conditions where they could grow food during short summer seasons. Game was sparse but present, and the surrounding forest offered materials for building shelter, adequate to survive harsh winters. It was not paradise by any measure, but it was remote enough that they might live undisturbed for years if they were careful and fortunate.